Hey, we're back. We're going to look at amending the Constitution. Section 1 was big, lots of concepts, the idea of federalism, checks and balances, separation of powers, popular sovereignty. Then we have the ideas found in the preamble. This was a lot of stuff to digest. And hopefully you took the time, you split it up into a couple different segments and took it piece by piece. There were also quite a few homework assignments that dealt with Section 1. There's just a lot of concepts in there. What we're going to look at today is Article 5 of the Constitution, which is the amendment process. How do we change the Constitution? Now, this is one of the things that the founders put in to give the Constitution flexibility, that they knew they didn't create the perfect document. But what they did is they created a mechanism for fixing and for updating the Constitution when they needed to. Now, with this Constitution, there's two different viewpoints. We're going to look at Thomas Jefferson's views and James Madison's views on amending or changing the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be updated by each generation to fit that generation's needs. Now, the Constitution, he said, shouldn't just be changed on a whim. It shouldn't be changed for some willy-nilly thing. But when society changes, the Constitution needs to change. And that each generation is a distinct nation with its own set of circumstances. And Jefferson believed that each generation had the right to govern themselves, but not be held back by some previous generation. Thomas Jefferson used the quote, or the quotes attributed to Thomas Jefferson, and he said, "The earth belongs to the living and not to the dead." And basically his viewpoint was, why should I have to be bound? Or let's look at today. Why should I have to be bound by some rules that guys who have been dead for over 200 years made up? Did they have any idea what's going on in 2020 in the United States? No. So why should we be bound to follow their rules and to follow their structure? We should be able to change it to fit our needs. And that's Thomas Jefferson's viewpoint. James Madison had a different opinion on changing the Constitution. James Madison thought the longer the Constitution stayed around and the longer it goes unchanged, the more accepting it became and the more authoritative it became. That because it's been around longer, everyone knows it, everyone knows the rules, and it has a greater stature, a greater authority to it. And Madison believed that if you just kept changing the Constitution, that what would happen is that factions could try to get an amendment changed that would benefit them, and then when another faction came into power, then they would change it, that would lead to chaos, that we could possibly have foreign influence or foreign interference in our government, that we really needed to keep this document, keep the Constitution as similar to or as unchanging as possible. So we have these two different viewpoints. Jefferson, hey, change it if we need to based on society's needs. And Madison's like, no, we don't need to change it because people can get used to it. People are accepting of it. And if it keeps changing, it's just going to lead to chaos. And so this brings up the question, is the Constitution a, quote, living document? And this is big. This is a big debate today in politics. How should we interpret the Constitution? Actually, right now, as I'm recording this video, there's a judge who has been nominated to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. And in her hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee, they've asked her, what is her belief on interpreting the Constitution? So that just gives you an idea that this is a big thing. And it goes back to Jefferson's views and even Madison's views, but it's how should we interpret the Constitution? What does the Constitution mean? Should we interpret it as our founding fathers wrote it? Or should it be based on what's going on today? Now, some people believe in what we call a strict interpretation. This is also called originalism, originalism and textualism. This is a strict construction view. And what this belief is that uh, the Constitution should be interpreted as the founding fathers wrote it. So it could be a literal interpretation, and conservatives or Republicans tend to believe in this. Amy Coney Barrett is a originalist. She believes in interpreting the Constitution as our founding fathers interpreted it back then. And what do a lot of strict constructionists go to interpret the Constitution? They go to the Federalist Papers, because that gave us a good idea of what James Madison and Hamilton and John Jay on how they interpreted the Constitution. So a lot of times they go back to the Federalist Papers, not every time, but that is a good source of information for originalists or textualists. And their belief is basically the same as Madison's, that if you just change it and change it and change it, how are we going to get any consistency? You know, if the Constitution means this one year and then 10 years down the road it changes to a different meaning, how is that consistent? How are we going to get anything going? And how can we not create or sow chaos by doing this? Other people believe in what we call a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And when we say loose, it means it's more open to opinion. What does what does this phrase of the Constitution mean in the context of today? Not what it meant back then, but how should it be applied today with today's society and today's needs? And so this is what we would say would be the living document, that it's open to interpretation, that it grows and it changes, just like we grow up and we change over time. We're a living person. It's a living document. Now, each side has pros and cons. There's good things about strict constructionists, and there's good things about loose constructionists, and then there's negative things about each side. You know, if we were to look at a negative thing about a strict interpretation, you know, think about cruel and unusual punishment. Back then in the 1800s, you know, well, in the 1700s, you know, being drawn and quartered was okay. Duels were okay. Public hangings were okay. Today, we would say, that's not good. That's not right. And so that, you know, but a true, strict, hardcore textualist would say, well, that's what they said was cruel. It was not cruel and unusual, so it should be allowed today. Now, with a negative thing about the loose interpretation is that I kind of mentioned this. How are we going to get any consistency if the rules always change on us? If the rules mean different things to different people at different times, that's not good. We like consistency. We like consistency in our lives, and if things change with every generation, that doesn't get us a consistent path forward. But I just wanted to bring that up. It's a really big thing today, guys. And if you watch the news, which you should be watching the news, you see Amy Coney Barrett on there, and they're talking about this right now. Now, with our Constitution, you have to think that it's only been changed 27 times. And our framers knew that it was not a perfect document, that there were compromises that had to be made. And what they did is they incorporated Article 5, which allowed the Constitution to be changed. The Founding Fathers knew that these wrongs or these compromises were going to be corrected. And this ability to incorporate our changing ideas of freedoms and what our liberties are, that changes over time. And so it keeps this document relevant. It keeps it practical. It keeps it meaningful to every generation. Now, with the amendment process, the Constitution has been changed 27 times. Now, we know the first 10 times were all at once. They were ratified in 1791, the Bill of Rights. But it's difficult to change the Constitution. And you think about it, 27 times, little over 200 times, 230 years of the Constitution. So we're talking once every 10 years, 9, 8 years that the Constitution changes. In reality, the last time the Constitution has changed, well, let's see. The Constitution has changed one time in my lifetime, and that was with the 27th Amendment in the early 90s. In your lifetime, the Constitution, there's not been an amendment to it. And so it goes in waves. Some, like in the 60s, we had several. 70s, we had one, I believe. 80s, none. 90s, one. The early 2000s, none. The 2010s, none. And so with the amendment process, it is difficult. And it's difficult to say the least. And the reason why it's difficult is that we don't want to change it on a whim. We don't want to change it to prevent a momentary heat of passion from changing the Constitution. Now, Article 5 describes the process. It's a really straightforward process. There's two ways to propose an amendment, and then there's two ways to ratify the amendment. Now, with this, I'm going to show you a chart in just a couple minutes that clarifies this. But this two-step process, it's part of federalism that Congress at the national level proposes it, and then it's ratified at the state level. And so the reason why they put this two-step process in, instead of just saying Congress can propose and ratify an amendment on their own, is to ensure that any change to the Constitution would reflect the national will. It would reflect the will of the people. That's popular sovereignty. And with the each process, it required a supermajority vote, not just a simple 51% majority. But with proposing an amendment, as you see right here, there's two ways they can be proposed, and each way requires a 2/3 vote. Now, the most popular way is through a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress, right here, 1AI, by Congress with the approval of at least 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. The other option is through a national convention with at least 2/3 of the state legislatures calling for a national convention, and then at the national convention, an amendment is proposed. Now, no amendments have been passed or have been proposed through a national convention. Now, we've come close to calling a national convention, but it's never happened. So every single one of our amendments has actually been proposed by Congress, this first step. Now, with the convention, it's a little gray. We've never done it, so we don't know exactly what the rules would be. And some people wonder, well, if we call a national convention to, let's say, we can have the 28th Amendment for term limits. We'll just say that. Could the National Convention then do other changes to the Constitution, or are they only limited to term limits? That's a question. And the Constitution doesn't really clarify that. Could this National Convention, if they call it for term limits, could they revoke the First Amendment? What would we do then? And so the National Convention has never been used. Now, to ratify it, it's two possibilities. One, which is 4B, 3/4, so 75% of the state legislatures have to approve it. Or the other process is that we have a state ratifying convention where 3/4 of the states at the state ratifying convention pass it. Now, How do we determine which option do we use to ratify the amendment? Well, it's in the amendment itself. So in the amendment, it says, we are proposing term limits. This will be ratified through either A, the state legislatures, or B, state conventions. So it's specified in there as to which method is used. This is the chart that I was talking about. This really simplifies it. It's good. There's two ways of proposing it in orange, and there's two ways of ratifying it. And so there's actually a possibility of four different ways. 2/3 vote by Congress, ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's one option. 2/3 vote of Congress, ratified by 3/4 of state conventions. That's another way. That's how all of them have been used so far. But there is that other option of proposing an amendment through a national convention, which can then be ratified by state legislatures or state conventions. So those are the four different methods. One more thing, and this is just some facts about the amendments. There's been, over 10,000 ideas on changing the Constitution. Now, with the actual proposing an amendment where it gets passed by Congress, 33 times have we have passed an amendment or proposed an amendment by Congress. Now we know 27 have been ratified, so that means 6 of them have been rejected, that we've never got to it. And one of your assignments is to look at these 6 rejected amendments, which is kind of interesting to look at. That pretty much sums up Section 2, the amendment process, the Constitution. Should it be changed? Should it not be changed? How should we interpret it? Does it belong to the living? That's all for now. Have a good day.